Andy Bannister wants to talk about religious hypocrisy. Not his own hypocrisy, of course, not the hypocrisy of his own religion, but about everyone else being hypocrites because Jesus wouldn't have it any other way. And I guess we're supposed to be impressed. Andy Bannister is utterly blind to the failings of his own religion and his own religious beliefs. Always has been, and likely always will be. But here, he does his best to tread lightly about the hypocrisy of Christianity, figuring it's not their problem, just the problem of everyone else. And Jesus apparently knew all of this back in the day, even though the actions of Jesus are entirely explainable if you get away from Andy's myopic religious lens. So why are the religious such hypocrites? Let's go find out.
Why are religious people such hypocrites?
Hell if I know. I just know that they are. Because if you look at any religious video, all of them call for faith over fact, belief over justification nonsense. They will point out, often wrongly, that the non-religious don't know something, yet their own beliefs rely on blind faith. Not objectively demonstrable fact. They pretend to know things that they simply do not know, because it makes them feel good to do so. And that makes the religious hypocrites.
Before we dig into the question of religion specifically, it's interesting to say right at the start that the word hypocrisy is everywhere in our culture.
That's partly because we live in a culture, in fact, on a planet full of hypocrisy. People saying one thing and then doing something entirely different. So right off the bat, let's get the definition of the word out of the way so we can compare what Andy says to what the word actually means. Hypocrisy is the practice of claiming to have moral standards or beliefs to which one's own behavior does not conform. And I think you'll see that this describes the religious to a T.
I hear people criticize politicians for being hypocrites, or they criticize bankers or lawyers or business people for being hypocrites. They criticize journalists for being hypocrites. They criticize the clergy and religious leaders for being hypocrites. It seems the word hypocrisy is everywhere in our culture. We live in a culture now when everyone is suspicious of everybody. We don't know who to trust, and so everybody is tarred with that brush of hypocrisy, and we can't trust them.
Which is why trust should never be given without having checked out what's being said. Remember the old maxim, trust but verify. Until you have a good reason to think that what you're being told is so, to believe what any individual says accurately represents the facts, you have to go and test their statements against the metric of objectively verifiable reality. Whether or not you want what they say to be true, it only matters if what they say actually is. You have to do your intellectual due diligence and verify it for yourself.
And there's a whole number of things we could say there, but one of the things that interests me right at the start is, as human beings, we have this tendency, we love to judge others. The problem is bankers, the problem is politicians, the problem is religion, but that ignores the fact that each one of us has the temptation and the tendency to be a hypocrite.
Now, you'll notice what he's doing here. But instead of dealing with the question at hand, are Christians, and I'll open this up to all religions here, but are they hypocrites? No, he doesn't want to talk about that. He wants to say that everyone is a hypocrite, so that when it turns out that Christians are every bit as bad, well, it doesn't sound so bad, does it? This is really doublespeak. He's trying to soften the blow when he invariably admits that he and others like him are base hypocrites because everyone is. So it's not that bad when he is. And then, of course, he's going to blame it all on sin or some other nonsense because, the devil made me do it. Just watch.
We don't live up to our own standards. We like people to think that we're better than we are. We don't want anyone to look into our hearts and see what we're really like. And sometimes it's very easy to throw stones at others without addressing the issues in our own hearts.
Exactly, Andy. Which is why you keep your comments shut off, so nobody can toss metaphorical stones at your own religious stupidity. Which, makes you a hypocrite.
And this is actually why religious hypocrisy is especially dangerous. Because if you are a religious person, it is very easy to start thinking of yourself as holier than, or better than, or more moral than the people around you. Because I follow the commandments, I go to church on Sunday, I am religious, and therefore I'm better than the people next to me.
Yet that's not really the problem, is it? Because the hypocrisy doesn't come because you think that you're better than others. It comes when you think you don't have to follow the same rules as everyone else, that your faith somehow gets rid of all those pesky requirements that you have to be able to prove anything about the things you believe. Faith is not a substitute for facts. It doesn't get rid of the need to have evidence for the things that you claim. It doesn't magically grant complete authority to your silly book of mythology. So long as you're making claims about the real world that we all inhabit, you have to use the same methodology and be held to the same standards as everyone else doing the same thing. But the religious know they can't do that because objectively examining their beliefs without faith doesn't convince anyone that it's true. Without emotion, religion collapses. And pretending that religion is anywhere near the same level as science, that's pure hypocrisy.
And we use religion as a mask to hide what our hearts are really like.
I don't care what your heart is like. I care what your brain is like. I care what your ideas are like. And sorry to say, they're all crap. Maybe you should do something about that.
And the interesting thing is how toxic and how dangerous that type of hypocrisy is was identified 2,000 years ago by Jesus himself.
Well, by words in a book of mythology, claimed to have come from Jesus anyhow. Because, as I said before, the religious simply assume their religion is true without having any means whatsoever to prove that it's true. But get on with your point, Andy. I know you'll screw it up somehow.
Jesus spent most of his public ministry criticizing and naming and calling out religious hypocrisy, especially in religious leaders.
Just like a lot of Christians today. Now, I agree that religious hypocrisy has been around pretty much as long as religion itself has been, mostly because the religious elite, the priests and the prophets and the supposed seers, got a lot of benefits out of being holier than thou. They got to tell people what the gods wanted them to do, which often meant what benefited the cleric, and certainly the holy men got paid, not doing anything particularly useful to earn it. Because the gullible have always been willing to cough up the cash to be told what they didn't understand, whether or not it was true. It happens today, it happened thousands of years ago, and none of it's really anything to be proud of.
Spotting the hypocrisy in religious leaders is not something we invented in the 21st century. Jesus was doing it 2,000 years ago. He spent a lot of his time criticizing the Pharisees, who in the Jewish world of the first century, they were the religious elite. They kept the commands, they were moral, they were, in the eyes of the people around them, they were incredibly religious, and they wanted everybody else to know how religious they were.
Maybe the reason he was criticizing the religious leaders of the day is because he was in direct competition with them, because he wanted people to stop listening to the hypocritical Pharisees and come follow him instead. I mean, that doesn't explain anything, does it? Nah.
And rather than praise them or say to people, hey, be like them, Jesus criticized them. He antagonized them. He critiqued them. He reserved his toughest words for those religious leaders. And by contrast, he spent most of his time hanging out with the wrong sort of people in the eyes of the Pharisees. Jesus hung out with tax collectors and prostitutes and sinners and people who the rest of society had cast to one side.
Just like the religious tend to do today. They cater to the poor and the destitute because they know that those people are more receptive to their message. Because the wealthy and the successful have less of a need for belief in an all-powerful deity than the poor and the downtrodden do. People who have no hope in the real world, but who look for hope in the imaginary afterlife. So it makes sense that Jesus went after the same target demographic that the churches today do.
Why was Jesus so anti-religious?
He wasn't anti-religious. He was starting his own religion. And if you look at pretty much any religion today, you'll find that they're all critical of other religions. I'm right, they're wrong. Why? Because they're in direct competition. Jesus wanted all of the people following the established religions to come over and follow him. So he points at the opposing religious leaders and says, hey, look at them, they're doing it all wrong. Come on, this isn't that hard to understand.
Because I think Jesus saw that the damage that religion could do when you use it to start looking down on others.
You mean like most Christians do today? Because, sure, that's not descriptive of pretty much every religion that has ever existed on the planet or anything.
You see, as human beings, we all have a tendency to want to look down on other people. We want to think that we're superior, that we're cleverer, we're smarter, we're nicer, we're more decent, we're more progressive, we're better than the people next to us, because we don't really want to address the issues in our own hearts.
I don't. I am not inherently better than anyone else at pretty much anything. I may be more rational than some people some of the time in some things. But my purpose in saying so isn't to inflate my own standing or my own ego. It's to tell people, hey, maybe you need to improve yourself. It's not to make myself look better. It's to genuinely help others to get better. But the religious, by and large, they don't do that.
And Jesus said the danger with religion is it could prevent you from seeing how dark your own heart is and how much you really need the grace and offer of forgiveness that God makes in Jesus to each one of us.
It's funny that Andy doesn't see that Christianity is every bit as bad as every other religion he thinks Jesus was criticizing. That Christianity doesn't do all of the things he's pointing out in other religions. Andy just turns a blind eye to his own failings while happily proclaiming them in others. And that makes Andy a hypocrite. Let's not forget that.
Because Jesus comes to each one of us and he doesn't care whether we're rich or poor or black or white or male or female or what our sexuality or background or any of that is. Jesus knows that each one of us has baggage. Each one of us needs to come to him and have the mess ups in our life dealt with. And Jesus opens his arms to us and says, come to me. Lay aside your cleverness. Lay aside your smugness. Lay aside your religion. Come to me, bow the knee and say, Jesus is Lord. Invite Jesus into your life and ask him to begin putting back together the mess that you've made of it. That is the way to stop being a hypocrite, because the gospel is the great leveler. When you get your handle on what Jesus says to you, you realize that you are in fact nothing. That's the bad news. But the good news is God has given you everything in Jesus.
Except that's your perception. But if that perception were true, then absolutely no Christians would ever be hypocrites. Yet the vast majority of them are, yourself included, Andy. This whole video is just a way to proclaim yourself and your religion as holier than everyone else, as a way to criticize every other religion while ignoring the same stupidity in your own. I don't even have to look at this from an atheist perspective, because it works the same no matter what religion you follow. It is ignoring all of the bad things that happen in the name of your religion and pretending that you're better than everyone else because you follow what you think of as the right imaginary friend. But I'll be honest, this didn't go where I thought it would, where I thought he was going to blame sin for religious hypocrisy, something I've certainly seen before. Because the religious never want to be personally responsible for anything bad that happens. It's all the fault of sin and we can't help it. But if you really think about it, Andy didn't even answer the question of hypocrisy. He just kind of glossed over it like, well, they expect me to speak on this subject. How do I do that without offending anyone or making Christianity look bad? This is pretty typical Bannister, because the point of his videos, like with most apologists, is to make the believers happy while pretending to say something deep and pithy. Except they never do. They're never honest. They're always hypocrites. But I guess that's what we've come to expect from religion, isn't it?